It began with a whisper, not a scream. A whisper carried on cold wind through the crumbling alleys of a French town whose name would soon vanish beneath the ash of fear. Autumn 1321, and the light of the dying sun fell across the shingles of rooftops already warped with rot. In the twilight, dogs nosed through the refuse outside the butcher stalls, looking for blood-soaked scraps. But this time, it wasn't awful they sniffed. It was something softer, something wrong. In one street, a woman emerged from her door, clutching her chest and mumbling prayers, her eyes fixed on the darkening well in the center of the square. That well, so ordinary, so ancient, had turned black overnight, its waters thick and sour. Some said it was poison. Others said it stank of milk. But then the baby disappeared, and then another, and another. No blood, no bodies, just emptiness in cradles, shrieking mothers, and the echo of lullabies cut short. It wasn't long before someone spoke the word that would unlock a century's worth of death. Heresy. Yet beneath the frenzy, behind the banners and sermons and swords, there lived an older story, coiled tight and buried in the marrow of a wounded land. The tale of how power feeds on panic, and how fear, once given a face, will devour whatever flesh it can find. The world above was built on ritual and stability. Kings ruling by God's grace, priests interpreting his wrath, peasants knowing their place beneath both. But beneath that surface lay a system that needed monsters to survive. Monsters to be blamed, hunted, and burned when crops failed or infants died without cause. In the year of our Lord 1321, France was a kingdom scabbed with anxiety. The Capetian dynasty, long dominant, was beginning to rot from the inside. The Templars had been purged barely a decade prior, their charred corpses feeding rumors of devil worship and secret rites. Jews, lepers, witches. Each group had in turn been blamed for the sickness of the soil, the spread of plague, the stillbirths, and the souring milk. But none of these explanations satisfied the hunger for something more primal, the kind of terror that doesn't just demand scapegoats, it demands sacrifices. So when the rumor emerged that babies were being eaten, not merely killed, not merely kidnapped, but ritually consumed, it struck a nerve that bled across every town and every parish. Because in this rumor, every fear found its voice. The catalyst came in Toulouse. A midwife, unnamed in records, remembered only in fragments of testimony extracted by pain, claimed that she had been paid in coin to look the other way as strangers took an infant from the cradle of a poor washerwoman. When pressed, she spoke of a man with yellow skin and a red beard, and then, under torture, she added another name, lepers. The lepers had taken the child. They had taken many children. They had gathered in the caves outside town, where they boiled the tiny bodies with powders and herbs stolen from Jewish apothecaries, reducing them to broth and bone for their secret rites. They smeared the fat of infants on their skin, the midwife said, to cure their sores. They drank the blood to ward off death. And it was not only lepers. She spoke of plots, letters exchanged between leper communities across France, coordinated poisonings of wells, alliances with Jews and Moors, a vast invisible network of subhuman conspirators whose goal was to annihilate Christendom from within. It made no sense, but it didn't need to. It explained the stench in the water, the howling dreams, the dead infants, and the unbearable ache of a world losing its shape. At the heart of the rising hysteria stood King Philip V, a man not yet broken, but already bent beneath the shadow of his father's cruelty and his brother's scandal. Philip was cautious, meticulous, not given to passions like his infamous grandfather Philip the Fair, who had annihilated the Templars and melted their wealth into the royal coffers. Yet in 1321, Philip found himself surrounded by fires he could no longer contain. Famine stalked the countryside after the wet years of 1315, 1317, when rains had drowned the grain and mothers had buried newborns beside potato stalks. Discontent festered in the north, rebellion whispered in the south, and the treasury bled gold into foreign wars. So when the rumors reached court that the lepers had conspired with Jews to poison wells and feast on Christian infants, Philip chose not to question, but to act. Perhaps he believed it, perhaps he didn't, but either way it offered a unifying terror, a visible threat against which the fragmented kingdom could rage in unison, a purging fire to burn away the rot. It began slowly. In villages and towns, priests began preaching against the baby killers, weaving them into sermons about judgment and the devil. Inquisition tribunals were reactivated, their scripts unchanged since the days of the Cathars. Public notices were nailed to church doors declaring a nationwide conspiracy of lepers. Infected souls turned enemies of God. Jews were implicated almost by default, as were foreign travelers, midwives, and even beggars who spoke unfamiliar dialects. The hysteria was self-feeding. Wells were sealed with wax and exorcised. Mothers clutched infants tighter and accused their neighbors of strange looks. Lepers, many of whom lived in segregated colonies outside the town walls, began to vanish. Sometimes they were dragged from their hovels by mobs. Other times they were seized by soldiers and interrogated under flame. But the first true massacre took place in the summer of 1321 in the town of Agen. Over 40 lepers, men and women whose bodies had already been half consumed by disease, were burned alive in a pit, screaming psalms until their lungs collapsed. The crowd watched in silence, and when it was over, a priest sprinkled holy water on the ashes and declared the town cleansed. But the sickness had only just begun, and as the flames devoured the twisted limbs of the accused in Agen, other towns took it as a signal, a sacred license to purge. By midsummer, the fire spread faster than disease itself, carried not on fleas, but on words, sharpened by desperation and the desperate need for order. In Poitiers, in Cahors, in Albi and Périgord, leprosariums were stormed by townspeople armed with pitchforks and torches. These were not executions carried out in court, but rituals of annihilation dressed in the robes of righteousness. The condemned were not even offered the dignity of names. Most had already been stripped of them when their flesh had begun to rot. What mattered was the spectacle, the way skin blistered and cracked in the fire, the way bone hissed when the marrow boiled. To the onlookers, these were not people but symbols, vessels of contamination and evil whose destruction could promise safety. And as the bodies burned, mothers held their children closer, convinced that every scream from the fire was one less demon to steal their babies in the night. But behind those screams was a silence far more terrible, the silence of the innocent who had no voice, whose deaths were not executions but offerings, the price paid to satisfy a kingdom's craving for purity. The edicts came next. From the royal chancery, Philip V issued formal orders. All lepers were to be arrested and examined for signs of conspiracy. Those found guilty, and guilt was a formality already etched into their flesh, were to be executed by burning. Any leper who refused to submit could be lawfully killed by local authorities. The king's seal turned lynchings into justice and suspicion into evidence. In some regions, entire leper communities were exterminated in a single week. Men who had once tended church gardens or begged outside chapels were hauled before tribunals and asked how many babies they had eaten, how much poison they had brewed, how many Jews they had kissed in pact. And under torture, they confessed, not to truth, but to whatever would stop the pain. They described orgies of filth, cannibalistic rituals in caves, secret meetings with rabbis who handed them powder to pour into wells. Each confession fueled the next round of arrests. Jewish communities, too, began to feel the noose tightening. Though officially protected by the crown, in practice they became the invisible architects of the horror, accused of supplying poisons, writing letters in Hebrew to coordinate the plot, and whispering curses over the bread of Christians. Some fled, others were imprisoned. Many simply vanished, swallowed by dungeons from which no records returned. Yet amid the bloodlust and smoke, there were those who doubted. Not out of compassion, compassion was in short supply, but out of fear that the tide might turn. If lepers today, who tomorrow? Merchants who sold them bread, priests who failed to condemn them quickly enough. But voices of caution were drowned in the chants of crowds, the hiss of torches, the clink of coins paid to informers. The madness had momentum now. Whole villages swore they had seen lepers bathing in babies' blood, dancing naked in moonlight, grinding infant bones into powder. The logic of plague had merged with the theater of holy war, and in that union anything was possible. For what greater evil could there be than one that fed on innocence, one that transformed Christ's command to suffer the little children into a spectacle of children suffering in fire? By September of that year, France was devouring its outcasts with a hunger unmatched in decades. The countryside was littered with burned-out leper houses, their stone walls stained black by smoke and righteous fury. In some places, the authorities ran out of executioners and had to draft townsmen into service, offering pardons, land, or even sainthood for those who cast the first torch. In Paris, pamphlets were circulated describing the conspiracy in lurid detail, how the lepers had made blood sausage from Christian infants, how they used powdered Jew bones to summon demons, how they had plotted to crown a leper king and turn France into a kingdom of filth. The lines between sickness, heresy, and treason blurred until none could be separated. And always, at the center of this storm, was the unspoken terror that perhaps the lepers were not monsters, but reminders. Reminders of how quickly the human body decays, how fragile the illusion of cleanliness and superiority truly is. Perhaps that was the true horror. Not that the lepers were guilty, but that they were once whole and could become us. As the year drew to a close, the massacres began to slow. Not from mercy, but exhaustion. There were fewer lepers left to kill. Many had fled into the forests or died in hiding. Some were betrayed by family, others by priests. Those who survived bore more than scars. They carried the weight of being named a disease rather than a person. Their colonies, once places of isolation, had become ghost towns haunted by the scent of burning. The Jews, too, faced renewed expulsions in the years to come, as the conspiracy, though never proven, became part of the national memory. It was not the lie that mattered, but its usefulness. And for Philip V, the usefulness had been clear: unify a fractured nation through fear, redirect hatred away from the throne, offer the masses a sacrifice to distract from their hunger. He died 3 years later, childless, his body rotting faster than expected, a fact some whispered was divine punishment. But the rumor of baby eating outlived him. It passed into legend, then into silence, then into the bloodstream of later genocides, where it would re-emerge again and again in different forms: blood libel, satanic panic, trafficking conspiracies, each a variation on the ancient lie that somewhere, someone, was stealing your children to feed an inhuman appetite. And as the fires cooled and the ash settled into the soil, what remained was not justice, but a land taught to see suffering as proof of guilt. A land where the absence of a cure could justify extermination. A land where the first step toward peace was always a scream, followed by silence. And still the memory lingered. Not in chronicles or statues, but in the inherited shudder passed down through generations. In the fear of the stranger who limps, the man whose skin flakes, the child who speaks in tongues or stares too long into the fire. In the shadow of the leper massacres, France did not heal. It redefined itself. It became a kingdom that learned to exercise its fear not through truth or care, but through violence made sacred, scapegoating made divine. And beneath this new religious order, there festered an older logic, that suffering is contagious, that ugliness is evil, that those who decay must be punished for reminding the beautiful of death. It was not law that governed this era. It was a dream of purity, constantly betrayed by the body's inevitable decline. And thus, the leper was not just a victim, he became a mirror held up to kings who feared their own rot, to clergy who doubted their own salvation, to peasants who watched their children cough and bleed and needed someone to blame for it. And what is a mirror but a threat when the face one sees is not holy? There were moments, brief, flickering, when truth threatened to break through. In some towns, bishops intervened to spare a handful of lepers, arguing that Christ too had touched the unclean. In others, mothers who had lost children began to question the stories, realizing that grief had made them pliable, eager to believe that their loss was not random, but plotted, orchestrated, punishable. But these voices were few and easily drowned by the roar of the crowd, and the sermons of priests who painted devils with human skin. The machinery of fear needed fuel, and every doubt extinguished was a log on the fire. To believe in the conspiracy was not madness. It was loyalty. It was patriotism, piety, sanity itself. And so the lie metastasized, embedding itself not just in policy, but in the soul of a people. In the centuries that followed, the story of the leper conspiracy would fade from official histories. It was too embarrassing, too grotesque, too obvious a stain. Chroniclers wrote of royal decrees and court politics, but omitted the children burned with their fathers, the women raped before the flames, the boys tortured until they named names that never existed. These were not omissions of accident, but of design. To remember the truth was to remember that France, the eldest daughter of the church, had once drunk the blood of its own to feel righteous, and such memories were dangerous, especially to monarchs who claimed divine right. Better to let the dead bury the dead. Better to let the horror remain a whisper, a myth, a madness attributed to a dark time before reason, as if reason itself were not so often the handmaiden of cruelty. But not all forgot. In dusty court records, fragments of the terror survived, lists of names scrawled in trembling Latin, confessions signed in blood or silence, reports from inquisitors who marveled at how readily pain produced guilt. And from these fragments a picture emerges, not of monsters, but of men. Men with sores who begged for bread, women who wept as their children were taken, priests who doubted and died for it, and kings who used fear like a sword, not to protect, but to distract. For in the end, the conspiracy was never about lepers or Jews or poisons or infants. It was about power, the need to assert it, the fear of losing it, the convenience of pointing away from the palace when the plague came knocking. And what, finally, of the babies? Did any truly die from poisoned wells, or were they always already dying, from hunger, disease, neglect, and only after their deaths did they become useful? It is perhaps the cruelest truth of all, that the conspiracy did not begin with murder, but with mourning. A mother loses a child, and someone must answer for it. A town suffers a fever, and someone must be blamed. And in that moment of grief, when the world is incomprehensible, the most comforting story is not one of randomness, but of intention. A villain can be punished, a monster can be burned, but chance is merciless. So the flames rose, and the kingdom watched, and as bodies curled into ash, the people felt safe, not because the danger was gone, but because it had been named, condemned, and erased. And perhaps that is the oldest ritual of all, to kill what reminds us of our fragility, to bury our fears in other people's flesh, and to call it justice. But the fire never truly went out. It merely changed form, found new victims, cloaked itself in new language, new laws, new rituals of purification. In the decades that followed, France would go on to invent other conspiracies, other enemies of the people. Heretics whispering in the night, witches dancing with Satan in forests, women who healed without license, thinkers who questioned too loudly. The same pattern would repeat, fear made visible through the selection of a scapegoat, horror made bearable by giving it a face, a name, a body to punish. And though the leper panic of 1321 would be forgotten in classrooms and chronicles, it became the prototype for every state-sanctioned paranoia that followed. It taught kings and inquisitors alike that the surest way to unite a fractured people is through the shared performance of hate. It revealed that collective cruelty, if wrapped in holy language, could feel like virtue, and that grief, when left unanswered, will always demand blood. Yet beneath the weight of massacre and madness, there are voices still, traces that endure in marginalia, in folk songs that never quite made sense, in prayers mumbled not to God, but to unnamed dead. A woman in Toulouse who carved her son's name into the stone of a ruined chapel. A half-burned letter from a leper who claimed to have been loyal to the crown. A notary's diary entry, written in a shaky hand. They cried when the children were taken. I heard them cry. And still I signed. These are not the stories that survive in gilded manuscripts or stained glass. but they are the ones that breathe. For history, when told only by victors and priests, becomes performance, a liturgy of lies polished for posterity. But in the shadows, in the broken sentences and half-erased names, the real France remains, bloodied, terrified, weeping, but real. It is there, in the silence after the screams, in the soot lodged between cobblestones, in the haunted stillness of abandoned leprosariums, that the true legacy of 1321 resides. Not in royal edicts or papal blessings, but in the psychological architecture of a nation that learned to look away. A nation that mastered the art of forgetting what it fears it could become. For the horror of the leper massacres was not just what was done to others. It was what it revealed about everyone else. That good men will kill when afraid. That mothers will cheer when told it will keep their children safe. That justice, when stripped of mercy, becomes indistinguishable from revenge. And that the human soul, when wounded deeply enough, will twist itself into shapes that resemble monsters, just to feel control. And so, when we ask how such a thing could happen, how hundreds of diseased, powerless men could be hunted like animals, burned alive in the squares of cities they once begged in, we must look not to the past, but to the mirror. For the machinery of scapegoating has not rusted with age. It hums beneath the surface still, waiting for its cue. A new panic, a new plague, a new enemy with a different face but the same function. And the question is never if it will return, but when, and who will be chosen next to carry the weight of a nation's fear. Even now, in museums and churches, one can find traces. A rusted bell once strapped to a leper's ankle, designed to warn the healthy of his approach. The sound it made, sharp and lonely, was once enough to clear a street. And that sound lingers, even if unheard, a phantom echo that rings through history, a reminder that beneath every great civilization lies a mass grave of those it sacrificed for the illusion of safety, and that among those bones are children who never knew why they burned, mothers who screamed until their voices bled, and men, filthy, dying, despised, who died not because of what they did, but because their bodies told the wrong story. This, then, is what remains, not a moral, not a resolution, but a wound. A raw, open wound in the memory of a nation that once murdered its most vulnerable not to protect itself, but to pretend it could. A wound made holy by fire, sealed with silence, and passed down like a curse. It is not France's shame alone. It is a lesson for all empires, all peoples who believe their violence can be righteous if wrapped in ritual, if buried beneath banners and bells. For cruelty sanctified becomes the most contagious disease of all, and those who forget this, who chant never again, without listening for the echoes, are always the first to light the next pyre.